the lecture 17 and the last final installment of this series, um, Jewish life in America. I want to discuss quickly that we discussed already before that Jews had been in in America from a very early age. Many Jews came with Columbus and came with Hernan Cortes in 1519 to Mexico. But the first Jewish community in North America is in New York, Sherit Israel, in 1654. Um, During the War of Independence, Jews were very active. We explained already, we talked about this. The Chaim Solomon, a Polish Jew who was a banker, a very wealthy man, gave a lot of money to the forces of the Patriots, and the Jews were thanked by Washington and by many of the American leaders. In fact, the first patriot to be killed was a Jew, Francis Salvador. In the 1830s, German Jews began to come, and America absorbs, immigrants throughout the period. But one of the things that I want to mention is the importance of how Jewish culture, and especially the Bible, figures so prominently in the founders of America. For example, the seal of Yale University is an open book with the words Urim Vetumim, the form in which the Kohen Gadol was able to determine the future, or what the response of Hashem to the questions posed by the Jewish people. Hebrew was a important language. They taught Hebrew at Harvard, Columbia, Yale, in all the colleges. In fact, some of the valedictorians, the speeches could actually they give their speeches in Hebrew or in Latin. Liberty Bell, of course, quotes the pasuk that proclaimed liberty throughout the land from Leviticus. I want to point out that during this period of time, in the 19th century, there is an interesting connection of the Jews with its history, where the Jews are beginning to talk about the one day they're going to restore Jewish life in Palestine. In fact, there is a famous speech by a patriot, Mordechai Manuel Noach, who advocates the restoration of Jewish life in Palestine. There was another man, Warder Cresson, a Quaker, who is so inspired by the idea of Jews return to Palestine that he becomes the first American consul in Israel, in Palestine, and he converts to Judaism. Very interesting person, Warder Cresson. But the Jews, in reality, and it's interesting that the War of Independence, but also in the Civil War, Jews are also on both sides of the conflict. One of the minister of and the Attorney General of the Confederacy was somebody by the name of Judah Philip Benjamin. Jews are beginning to come, especially from Germany, during this period of time. And when they do come, and I want to point out that is before the Civil War. In 1854, for example, Isaac Mayer Wise arrives in the state in America, and they begin to talk about a new kind of Judaism. The Reform Judaism was so dominant at this time that if it were not for the fact that more millions of Jews are going to come at the end of the century, all of America would have been reformed. So the Reform, we will discuss in a little bit later, have a philosophy called that it has its own power and its own detachment and departure, rather, from Jewish tradition. This is in the 1850s. In the 1875, 1875, we have the first reform seminary for rabbis. There are many traditional rabbis, nevertheless, and I'll tell you in a moment an interesting story. In 1883, HUC declares the first graduating class with a big banquet. And at the banquet, they serve, as it was traditional now for the reform, shrimps, clams, and meat, and followed by a dairy dessert, ice cream. This enraged the traditionalists among them. And although the reform movement continued to be what they are, many of these Jews, particularly Sephardic Jews, Salvatore Morais, and others, form what is the beginning of the conservative movement. And in 1886, they create its own seminary called the Jewish Theological Seminary, eventually attracting some very important scholars. One of them is the Marcus Jastrow, the one who creates the Aramaic English dictionary, very important dictionary to learn Talmud. And then they invite a famous person, Solomon Schechter, a scholar from Cambridge who had been famous for discovering the Cairo Geniza fragments. We discussed this other times. He actually comes to lead the Jewish Theological Seminary and becomes, in a sense, the intellectual father of the conservative movement. We will discuss a little bit more what is the conservative movement in a moment. That is more traditional than the reform, but it is also not a departure from the concept that God revealed a Torah and that the tradition of the rabbis, Torah Shebe'al Peh, the oral Torah, it has its own authenticity. I want to talk about, if it were not for the millions of Jews who came to the United States between 1881 and 1924, millions, Reform Judaism would have been the only group in America. I want to talk a little bit about reform. They begin to say no head covering is not necessary, no observance of the dietary laws. Some even move services from Saturday to Sunday. There's no need to have a get for a divorce document. Patrilineal descent. A person born from a non-Jewish mother, so long as his father is Jewish, is considered to be Jewish. In conversion, there's no need for a circumcision or a mikvah. These incredible things. This was instead of rituals, the reform had social activism. In the Pittsburgh platform that dominated the reform movement in 1885, they write, the purpose of Judaism is to solve, on the basis of righteousness, the problems of society. Reform movement becomes so connected to social activism, as it happens even today. In the 1930s, there was a professor who lamented that the Reform rabbis do not know Judaism. And so he said there are two kinds of Reform rabbis: those who believe Judaism is social justice, and those who know Hebrew. So the Reform have their own halacha, their own law. So if somebody says to him, well, you keep kosher, they would say, I don't do that. I don't have to do that. I'm Reform. It's like a new religion. Sadly, at the beginning, they also, the distancing from the Jewish people so much that they even opposed Zionism. Eventually, some became more Zionist. Later on, Abba Hillel Silver and Stephen Watts were Reform rabbis who were very pro-Zionist. And many rabbis later on, especially when Hitler came to power, they understood the need of a Jewish homeland and they supported Zionism. Unfortunately, today, the Reform movement sees its connection to Israel mainly as a form of reforming, improving Israel by his activism on Israeli politics. The conservative movement is the other movement, which is a very important one. Is it it wanted to maintain the concept of Jewish customs. So if the Jews observe Shabbat, we have to observe Shabbat. If the Jews observe Kashrut, the Jew has to be kosher. It lacked the concept that we do not observe Kashrut because the Torah says it or because God says it, but because the Jews did it. Very strange. It worked for a while. Unfortunately, today we see that the conservative movement, this is not enough. You know, I don't have to do what my grandfather did necessarily, especially if it's inconvenient. And that's why they're losing so many people. The Orthodox movement created in 1886, interestingly enough, or the same year as Jewish Theological Seminary, another seminary for Orthodox rabbis called Yeshiva University. The concept of university was yeshiva and university to connect secular studies with Jewish studies and Torah. They call it in Hebrew Torah umada, Torah and science. The most famous rabbi in the Yeshiva University, they invited a very great scholar by the name of Moses Soloveitchik. When he passed away, his son, Yosef Ber Soloveitchik, was the most important leader of the Orthodox Jewry in the beginning, in the middle of the 20th century. I want to talk briefly about some of the other personalities that we find in America. Of course, one of the most important ones is Louis Brandeis. Louis Brandeis is the first Jew in the Supreme Court, first Jewish justice. He was liberal. He fought for the labor unions, for minimum wage. But one important thing, he was an ardent Zionist. He was a lover of the Jewish people. Louis Brandeis. Another person who was very famous and very important was Albert Einstein, a very important part in the Jewish community in America. Albert Einstein, of course, was a German scientist. He came to America to give lectures in 1933. While he was giving lectures here in America, his home in Germany was ransacked by the Nazis. So obviously he never went back. He was offered a position, very important position by the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, and he remained in America. One important aspect about Einstein, he would remain, in addition to being a great scientist, fiercely loyal to the Jewish people. He was a Zionist. He loved Zionism. He loved Israel. In fact, Ben-Gurion offered him to be the first president of Israel. He said, it's not for me. I'm not a diplomat. One important part about Einstein, which I want to mention, is I once went to somebody's house and I saw a letter signed by Albert Einstein. The matter was unimportant. It wasn't a matter of state or science. It seemed like a simple matter of courtesy. Albert Einstein was the kind of a person who took the time to write a letter to a simple person. I want to mention other important personalities of this time that you may know about. One, of course, is Abraham Joshua Heschel, the very important philosopher connected with the conservative movement, especially, very influential. And Mordechai Kaplan, who's also part of the Jewish Theological Seminary, who created this new movement called Reconstructionists. But let me go back.
Just, I hate to interrupt, but I may forget.
Okay, I will. Okay, we'll try. I want to talk a little bit about, I have a curriculum to cover. I want to talk a little bit about other personalities, very important in the Orthodox world. Rav Moshe Feinstein, the most important decisor in America and perhaps the world, created a yeshiva in New York, Mesivta Tiferet Yerushalayim. And another important personality, Rav Aaron Kotler, the Lakewood Yeshiva in 1943. In a way, I've given you a kind of a snapshot of American Jewish life. Obviously, we have in America great philanthropists, people who build, like the Jacob Schiff, and of course, the creators of a lot of businesses, Bloomingdale's, the financiers Lehman, um, the Marcus Goldman from Goldman Sachs, very important Jews. We've occupied, and now, of course, in America, there are other Jews whose connection to Judaism is much less important, like the people in Google or Mark Zuckerberg, whose connection to Judaism is very, very light. But the important thing about America is a place where Jews are able to develop in ways perhaps that no other country has given us. Having said that, I want to point out that the same thing could have been said about Germany. Never before had a country offered us so much. And another country that gave us the same argument, the same Spain, until 1492. No other country had given us what Spain did. Sadly, we know what the end of Spain was. We know what the end of Germany is. We do not know what the end of America will be. And with this, I would like to conclude this series by offering a little bit of some lessons that we learn from this class that we've given. First of all, we've covered in the last 17 sessions, which I thought were going to be less. We cover 3,500 years of Jewish history, starting from Joshua to the present. We went from the year 1300 before the Common Era to the year 2000. And this, throughout this period, the Jews were on a march. A march started with Abraham, monotheism, morality, human dignity. These are the things that we've contributed to the world and that we continue to teach the world. The Jewish people have a mission in the world which we have accomplished and we continue to do. Another important lesson that we learned in this period of learning is the Jews don't assimilate. The Jews can't assimilate. As Bilam said in the famous blessing, Am levadat yishkon, a nation that dwells alone. Somehow we do, even if the Jews want to assimilate, they don't let us. An example is in Russia, where the Jews who have no knowledge at all. They would have been easily assimilated. But the Russians decided to put in the passport of every Jew, Evrei, so that they will never forget. And they were treated as Jews, regardless of whether they wanted or not. Trotsky was the least Jew that he could have been, and yet he was displaced because he was a Jew. And that is the other lesson that we learned. We've survived because they haven't let us assimilate it. Another amazing lesson that we learned is that Jews do not stay in any place for too long, or not forever. Who could have imagined in 1400 that the Jews would disappear from the Iberian Peninsula? Who could have imagined in 1930 that the Jews would disappear from Germany? Is America next? Judging from what history teaches us, I would dare say the answer is yes. The Jewish people have a strength and an endurance which enable it to surmount all the crises of its past, and were able to outlast the most powerful empires of antiquity. Although we have lost many people to assimilation, the Jewish people remains, and remains proud of its heritage. I think that this is the concept that we have learned throughout this history, that there is somehow a higher power. That's the message that we've given the world, that controls the world. We've seen it in our history, how time after time, Jews were saved from disaster in ways which can only be called providential. As the famous story of the emperor who had a philosopher who was teaching him about God. And one day, impatiently, the emperor said to the philosopher, please, you talk always about God. Can you give me one example, one proof that there is a God in the world? And the philosopher, without hesitation, said to him, "Yes, your majesty, the Jews." Jewish history proves that there is a God in the world. I want to tell you something about a statement from John Adams, who says the following: "I will insist that the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. If I were an atheist and believe in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited this earth. The Romans and their empire were but a bubble in comparison to the Jews. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern." John Adams, 1805. My dear friends, the history of the Jewish people is not finished, although this class is finished, but the history will continue because we still are in the march until the end of history, when we will bring redemption to the world through the Messiah. And then at that time, the nations of the world will come to the Jewish people and say, "Thank you for what you have taught us, and please teach us more." As the prophet says, "Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah, udvar Hashem Yerushalayim." Out of Zion shall come forth Torah and the word of God from Yerushalayim.